Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for the weather for cooperating and letting us have some dry weather as we begin. My name is John Cusick, and on behalf of the Thoreau Society, I am delighted to welcome you to the awarding of the 2025 Henry David Thoreau Prize for Literary Excellence in Nature Writing. I have a couple items to mention before we get started. Our first ever Thoreau Society Reads event will be a discussion of Rob Macfarlane's book, The Wild Places, on July 11th during our annual gathering. More information can be found in your programs and on our website. The Wild Places and Macfarlane's newest book is A River Alive. I've seen lots of copies around here, are available for sale and for signing after the talk around the corner in the back room, and it'll also be available in person or online at the shop at Walden Pond. Next week, we kick off the Thoreau Society's annual gathering and the discussion of this year's theme, Thoreau's Revolutions, with a free Zoom event on June 14th at 11 a.m. Please check out our website to register. We also want to extend an invitation to all to celebrate Thoreau's birthday with us in Concord this year. Saturday, July 12th, during the annual gathering, we are offering a day of free programs. It will begin with a keynote lecture from award-winning writer Camille Dungy, entitled Against Solitude, Rethinking Thoreau. Dungy's latest book, Soil, A Black Mother's Garden, is a seminal work that expands how we talk about the natural world and the environment. Our free day of programs on July 12th will conclude with a happy hour and book sale with free food and over 25 authors on site to share their new books. We hope you can join us. Tonight, we celebrate one writer's remarkable achievement in this field. But before we begin, it's important to remind ourselves that understanding and caring for the natural world, our common home, is a collaborative effort that unfolds over many generations. When we speak a word for nature, we add our voices to those of people who have spoken other tongues in other times, and they have learned to sing the songs of their own homelands. As we begin our celebration of one of the very best in nature writing today, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the territory of the Mesquitequid people, a community within the Massachusetts Confederation and the Wampanoag world, part of the hundreds of native nations who learned to live well on this continent in the thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The Mesquitequid people built their lives at this juncture of three rivers, a home full of rich meadows and thick forests. They caught fish and gathered mussels in the waters, planted corn, beans, and squash in the great fields, hunted deer in the woods, and sought to live in harmony with their many human and non-human neighbors. They welcomed the first English settlers and sought to live alongside them, teaching them how to live well along this peaceful river's banks until they were caught up in the brutal violence of King Philip's War. Henry Thoreau believed they had all vanished, but throughout his life, he sought to learn something of the indigenous wisdom that shaped their relationship to this land. His first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, is an effort to capture this knowledge in river form, stringing his own history and New England's along this ribbon of water, what he calls a huge volume of matter ceaselessly rolling through the plains and valleys of the substantial earth with the moccasined tread of an Indian warrior, making haste from the high places of the earth to its ancient reservoir. Thoreau lovingly cataloged the people, plants, and fish whose lives were intertwined with the river, wondered what a crowbar would do against the Borica Dam, which barred the migrations of fish and which is now finally slated for removal. And he learned to see the river as part of the unfolding mythos that drenches the world in meaning and mystery. He was learning to see, gradually, through native eyes. If he thought mistakenly that the land's original people had gone, we celebrate the fact that their descendants continue to gather, and we thank them for their long stewardship of this place that we too are learning to love. The Thoreau Society is old for an author society, the oldest and largest in the United States. The Thoreau Prize is new, but it's quickly become a keystone in our work to keep Thoreau's writings and ideas alive around the globe and across generations. Dale Peterson started the prize in 2010. He began working with the Thoreau Society in 2017, with the full administration passing into our hands in 2019. During these past 15 years, we have been privileged to honor a slate of writers who have ably followed Thoreau in speaking a word, many words, for nature. E.O. Wilson, Linda Hogan, Mary Oliver, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Jane Goodall, Terry Tempest Williams, and Drew Lanham, among others, writers who have helped us see our beautiful and troubled world in stunning, miraculous detail, and who have mapped and modeled the many ways we can fight to save it. We are grateful to the many donors who have fully endowed this landmark prize. Together, we are now able to better foster the ongoing legacy of Thoreau's work, the long task of using the written word to build a more just relationship with all of our neighbors. Thanks to everyone who took part in this effort to build a lasting forum for honoring the very best nature writers at a time when their words and wisdom are so desperately needed. We're grateful to the Trinitarian Congregational Church, this beautiful space, and particularly to Judy and Ed for hosting this event in such a storied home. The TriCon claims several members of the Thoreau family as charter members, though not Henry himself, of course, who is loath to join any organization. Thanks as well to the staff of the Thoreau Society and our friends who have sweated the details that make this process work, especially Corinne Smith, Rich Picaretto, and Rebecca Migdal, who handles all the details. And thanks in particular to the Thoreau Prize Committee, a truly inspiring group of writers, editors, and scholars who discussed with inspiring passion and care the many wonderful candidates for this prize. This year, they have chosen well indeed. And it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the Thoreau Prize Committee and past president of the Thoreau Society, Rochelle Johnson, who will introduce our 2025 Thoreau Prize recipient.
It's wonderful to see you all here tonight. Robert Macfarlane is a fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. His books have been translated into more than 30 languages and adapted to film, television, radio, theater, music, and dance. They have been New York Times bestsellers, winners of the National Outdoor Book Award, and included in The Guardian's 100 Best Books of the Century. Robert Macfarlane also has received the American Academy of Arts and Letters E.M. Forster Award for Literature, and he has twice been an outside contender for the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Thoreau Prize Committee chose to recognize Robert Macfarlane because he epitomize, the promise of Thoreauvian nature writing at this moment in human and environmental history when we urgently need its gifts. Like Thoreau before him, Robert Macfarlane uses his writings to challenge assumptions and politics, to invite activism and ethical engagement, and to urge readers to recognize non-human nature through our habits of living. Much like Thoreau, Robert Macfarlane pursues the wild, its potential, what it means, and, in Robert's words, its instinct for resurgence, its irrepressibility. Also, like Thoreau, Macfarlane seeks to recover the potency of language, whereas Thoreau in Walden aims to recover words such as simplify and phrases such as living deliberately. Macfarlane in Landmarks offers us whole glossaries of landscape and humanity that might otherwise continue to fade from memory and use. We learn, for example, the variety of words for uplands, woodlands, and flatlands, and for edgelands and their creatures. Words such as smuse, which refers to the gap in the base of a hedge made by the regular passage of small animals. In The Lost Words, Macfarlane and illustrator Jackie Morris recover a different category of words, those recently removed from the Oxford Junior Dictionary. Words such as acorn, bluebell, lark, wren. They removed these words to make space for others deemed more relevant to children passing childhood largely indoors and accompanied by screens rather than seeds, flowers, and birds. The Lost Words is thus a work of resistance through colorful poetry and spellbinding illustrations. The book, quote, summons the lost words back into use. Macfarlane and Morris do more similar work in The Lost Spells, a book inviting readers of all ages to revel in nature as astonishing and in language as song. Macfarlane's books alert us to the contours of the natural world through metaphor and mountain, through hollows and braes, and the underland of geologic time. With him, we venture into Norwegian sea caves, the Greenland ice cap, the Paris underneath Paris. In his book, The Old Ways, Robert walks ancient trails to demonstrate that, quote, paths are human. They are the traces of our relationships. In the wild places, he guides us to his, quote, recognition that wildness weaves with the human world rather than existing only in cleaved-off areas. In his astonishing new book, Is a River Alive?, Robert invites us to imagine what it truly means to know rivers as living beings of which we are a part. He journeys along 3 rivers with local people working to save each of those rivers' lives. Engaging politics, ethics, law, and activism, and sharing new depths of his own emotion, Robert navigates legal questions, indigenous knowledge, and mesmerizing riverscapes. This newest book also begs us to consider what the world's dying rivers will mean for our children, for each other's children, for Robert's own 3 children. In a recent interview about this latest book, Robert speaks to a desire to re-enchant the natural world. In the interview, he asks, that word, re-enchantment, can feel fragile, can't it? It can feel fragile. Yet Robert explains in the interview that enchantment might, quote, feel particularly fragile at a moment like this one, when an entire political machine in this country, the United States, is dedicated to the opposite of anima, to the opposite of life, to the flattening of forms of utterance and relation that exceed the fiscal, the instrumental. This statement by Robert Macfarlane called to my mind the list of words now being purged from the websites of federal agencies in this country. As Robert states in the interview, in many ways, this is precisely the moment when enchantment is at once vulnerable and powerful. We need, he says, structures, forms, rhythms of expression which open and are open, and which make possible forms of imagination that replenish precisely that which is under assault. Robert's comments about re-enchantment led me back to Thoreau's journal entry for August 3rd, 1852. On that summer day, Thoreau heard through his open window a cricket creak in the shade and the sound of a distant piano. Thoreau reflects on the duet of these sounds. They created a music, he said, which reminded him of similar earthly melodies, a thrumming of piano strings arriving to his ear from beyond the gardens and through the elms. That concert stole into his being, he writes, quote, elevating him into a more glorious sphere of life. He writes, I am affected, says he feels attuned to the universe. Thoreau then turns, as Macfarlane has, to the word enchantment. Thoreau writes in the journal, we say we are enchanted, and what I am impressed by is the fact that this enchantment is no delusion. It is a fact, such as what we call our actual existence, but it is a far higher and more glorious fact. It is evidence of such a sphere, of such possibilities. Although Thoreau struggles to name this feeling that is at once spiritual, sensational, and slightly awkward, perhaps because enchantment is indeed fragile, Thoreau also insists that enchantment is real, is true. Quote, it is its truth and reality that affect me, he writes. Your work, Robert Macfarlane, reminds us that although nature's expressions of energy and existence are vulnerable, they exceed both our apprehension and our experience. In a time when we are being told which words we may use, which forms of justice we may acknowledge, in which we are somehow supposed to hold in contempt, we desperately need your extraordinary commitment to re-enchanting the human place amid this world. The Thoreau Prize Committee thanks you, Robert, for reclaiming words, rescuing memories, and saving story. So tonight we honor you, your insistence on salvaging the words and places and life forms through which we might honor each other, this earth, and our music. Please join me in celebrating Robert Macfarlane.
Hello, Concord. Hello, everyone who's watching at home. Hi, Mum and Dad. Thank you for gathering here. What an evening for this Brit from the East to turn up here and to be met so warmly, to be introduced with that beautiful essay in the full sense of the essay as a testing and a trying and an exploration. It was very moving to me to be spoken of like that. Your mention of words that are banned recalled to me that I learned 2 days ago that the small book of spells that Jackie Morris and I both wrote, I found out had been banned from a school because it had the word spells in the title. Enchantment's a dangerous thing. Power doesn't like it much, likes to keep it under control. What gratitude I have to the committee, to the society, to all those involved in this evening for the award of this year's Thoreau Prize, and it still feels strange on the tongue and wonderful on the tongue. And the news came as a gust of joy early in the new year, and it has continued to buoy my heart up ever since. Just a slight side note about that word boy. Do you say buoy? That is the difference between our nations. Well, it's continued to buoy my heart ever since. I just want to granulate my gratitude a little. I want to thank John, who just spoke, Rebecca, Migdal, Richard Picaretto, all of the Thoreau Society. To the committee as a whole, I'm so grateful to you. I know something of the work involved in awards. I judged the Booker Prize twice and read 152 novels each year for that. So I hope it's been a little bit less laborious than that. But the labour is non-trivial, and the outcome is vastly appreciated. I've been made so welcome today. I'm at Walden Pond for the first time. Never been here, taught Thoreau for so long, read him for so long, never made it to the pond, and we had a wonderful walk before the rain came. Richard Higgins, Anna Westwinter Rasmussen, Catherine Staples, and Thor, the legendary Robert Thorson. I thank Corinne Smith and the team here in this spectacular church for their work in enabling this evening's event. And finally, and no, I hadn't forgotten you, Rochelle Johnson, who brought me the news of the prize and who has liaised and corresponded with me with limitless patience and good humour and generosity, and who has threaded the eye of the logistical needle with the camel of my itinerary that has enabled me to be here today. You rock. Thanks, Rochelle. I want to speak to you of rivers, and I want to speak to you with rivers. Thoreau did come to rivers perhaps surprisingly late, and we think of him as a pond person, a lake person, of course. And actually, John has already quoted the passage that sets my remarks going this evening. 5th of September, 1838. I think he's 21 at the time. Would that be right? I'm in the right room to get that fact checked. For the first time, it occurred to me this afternoon what a piece of wonder a river is. 21, and he'd never noticed. A huge volume of matter ceaselessly rolling through the fields and meadows of this substantial earth, making haste from the high places to its restless reservoir. A huge volume of matter. This is a materialist definition of a river, and it recalls to me the phrase of the natural theologian Richard Bentley, who was a close correspondent of Isaac Newton, who in a 1692 sermon dismisses rock and water as brute, inanimate matter, worthless, he says, in value when compared to what he calls the soul of one virtuous and religious man. And both of those phrases, I think, are at least conceptually indebted to Aristotle's great chain of being, that durably consequential mismodelling of existence as a ziggoratic hierarchy with humans only overtopped by angels at the summit, rather than as the immense web in which we are all entangled nodes. And as you will know, Aristotle's great chain of being was enthusiastically cathected into the bloodstream of medieval European thought, principally by the scholastics. It was refortified in early modern thought by Genesis's doctrine of humans as having dominion over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And now the great chain of being is once again reviving and being muscularized by J.D. Vance and the wider Trump administration. The Aristotle-Vance axis is not one you were expecting to hear about today, I know that, but this administration, and Vance in particular, has made clear its commitment to the doctrine of human exceptionalism and supremacism, of which a little more in due course. It didn't take Thoreau, of course, long to dematerialize, to mythicize, to metaphorize the matter of rivers, just as it did not take him long to metaphorize most things, and part of his brilliance, as we know, lies in his ability as a thinker to funambulate that scintillatingly slender line whereupon the living world becomes both itself and far more than itself. He has that remarkable and prolific capacity to make matter both clapper and bell, and thereby to set the universe reverberantly ringing. Rivers do run through much of Thoreau's work, indeed, as Thor has argued. Though Thoreau is most associated with the flat water of the lake and pond, he was, in fact, a man of the river. He was, writes Robert, born on the river. He loved it, he felt its flow in his veins, and the river, as he said, meanderest forever in the bottom of his dreams. And Thoreau's first book was Riverine. Explicitly, it encountered the Concord and the Merrimack as agents as well as settings. And in that book, as my daughter would put it, those two rivers both possess main character energy. And they really do, and of course they do in all our lives, and indeed the flourishing of rivers in the northern hemisphere at least has been more or less coeval with the flourishing of humans. The Holocene is also the Hydrocene, or at least the river scene. Thoreau was a wonderful theorist of writing, we know, and he often used the motions of water to figure the tempi and the rhythms of prose, things that interest me very much, noting how certain sentences and paragraphs ripple on like a freshet or flow as glibly, love that, as a mill stream sucking under a causeway. He notes how certain authors attain what he calls, I think slightly cattily, the full tide of their discourse, and he writes about what he definitely cattishly calls the charm of fluent writing. And he observes with fascinatingly precise hydrological inflection, and I haven't really got to the bottom of this one, so I launch it as a thought here. And long before William James coins the stream of consciousness, how the flow of thought is more like a tidal wave than a prone river, and is the result of a celestial influence, not of any declivity in its channel. Small prize for anyone who can decode that by the end of my talk. He knew that water is the great elemental disguise artist. Rocks an astonishing disguise artist. It just takes a little bit longer about its work. It's a prolific allotroper of itself, water. It's always morphing and phase shifting from ice to steam to snow to rain to hail, and it is always, always seeking bodies, human and earthly alike. And we here are all part of the water cycle. We are all water bodies, flowed through and flowed on. And when we run, we are rivers, and when we are seated, we are ponds. I speak to a congregation of Waldens in front of me. In that same diary entry from 1838, the 21-year-old one with which I began, he speaks of rivers reaching the sea as the end of the matter. It's not, of course, because when a river reaches the sea, fresh mingles with salt, and river and sea become both and not single, and water re-begins its ascent to the atmosphere, preparing to fall once more as rain and birth a river. 1858, 20 years on, in his journal, he notes, I think, beautifully that a river is superior to a lake in its liberating influence. It has motion and indefinite length. A river touching the back of a town is like a wing. It may be unused as yet, but ready to waft it over the world. River towns are winged towns. Yes, most towns and most cities are winged towns because we have built on water, and we are gathered in a winged town today. And I live in a winged town, the winged town of Cambridge, the other Cambridge, through which runs foundationally the river Cam Bridge, the bridge of the Cam. And I'm doubly lucky because not only do I live in a winged town and near a river, but I live near the birthplace of a river, which is a spring. And the stream who rises there as a spring becomes Hobson's Brook, then Vickers Brook, then the River Cam, then the River Great Ouse, and then it meets the sea at the Wash. Spring becomes stream, becomes river, and all three seek the sea. I speak with that very slight rotation of grammar, not of the stream that flows and the spring which rises, but the stream who flows and the stream and the spring who rises. It's a small, but I think, to me at least, significant shift of linguistic posture away from objectification and towards what Robin Wall Kimmerer, one of the extraordinary series of writers who precede me in this pulpit, as recipients of this prize, and that's one of the things that makes me proudest and happiest, is seeing the line that I join, remarkable writers all. It's a small shift towards what Robin Wall Kimmerer famously calls the grammar of animacy, that is, language use which recognizes and honors the intense and binding reciprocities in which we all exist with the living world. And while writing this most recent book on rivers and water, I inevitably began to wonder about how, as a writer, I could try in language to bring skeptical readers, rational readers, myself included, rational writer, closer to an understanding of, even a belief in, a river as a living being, and not only merely, sorry, Henry David, a volume of matter, which is predictably and exhaustively knowable. 5 weeks ago, a close friend of mine died, and he died too fast and he died too young. And it was the next day to the little spring near my house that I went, and I went instinctively, really, for 3 days, beginning the day after I'd learned that he'd died. And I found it hard to explain this away to myself, which is inevitably my instinct. I think I just wanted to be with the water as a friend, as a companion, as a medium. Horatio Clare, wonderful Anglo-Welsh writer, said in the summer just gone, he said, speaking of someone that he had lost, the boundary between life and death is permeable both ways to love. It's one of the most wonderful lines I've heard and read in a long time. That felt very true at the Springs, where I was able to think with love of my friend Jamie and to remember the love that he had showed me when he was still alive. Rivers run through people as surely as they run through places. They irrigate our bodies, our stories, our languages, our songs, our memories, our conversations, and everyone, even if you live in Cambridge, lives in a watershed. Where is the literature which gives expression to nature, asks Thoreau famously, and he turns to freshwater for his answer. He would be a poet who could impress the streams into his service to speak for him. I'm going to pick a slight fight with Henry David again here. I don't much care for the subordinacy of his metaphor here, that notion of impressing the streams into service as speakers for the poet. There is, I think, an echo here, an ethical echo at least, of that early account of rivers as volumes of matter, the presumption that rivers are inanimate, ready to be instrumentalized as prosthesis or tool, that they are resources and not life forces, dead and not alive, and that we might follow them to the end of their matter. About 5 years ago, I began making the first notes towards a book about the ideas of life, and I jotted a quick triplet of questions to myself under the heading Anima. Can a forest think? Does a mountain remember? Is a river alive? And it was the last of those that drew me on. And one morning when I was walking to school with my son Will, who was 9 at the time, and in the way that children have of feigning interest in what their parents do, at least briefly, he said, "What's the title of the book you're working on, Dad?" And I said, "Is a River Alive?" And he said, "Well, duh, that's going to be a short book, Dad." Because the answer is yes. I thought about submitting that as my manuscript, but something told me that even if we printed it beautifully, in the centre of each of 300 pages, it probably wouldn't cut the editorial mustard. So, is a river alive? Is a river alive? How we answer this strange and confronting question matters deeply now, and even the asking of it is a first step. And for those who, like me, have been largely raised on rationalism, to imagine that rivers might live or die or even have rights is challenging and counterintuitive work. And while I long for the answer to that question to be as simple as Will felt it to be, I know it not to be. And the great Ursula Le Guin wrote with characteristic lucidity about the effort involved in this unlearning, this reimagining. She says, one way to stop seeing trees or rivers or hills only as natural resource is to class them as fellow beings, kinfolk. I guess, she says, in a very late piece of writing, I'm trying to subjectify the universe because look where objectifying it has gotten us. To subjectify is not necessarily to co-opt, to colonize, to exploit. Rather, and this is the phrase which really stayed with me, it may involve a great reach outward of the mind and imagination. And it took me 4.5 years to undertake and attempt to make that great reach outwards of mind and imagination. I traveled to places in the world, Ecuador, India, Canada, where rivers are being imagined in radically different ways to the rationalist norm. It brought me into contact with scores of brave and visionary people who are working to redefine the ways rivers are conceived of and treated, and who are working really to redefine life itself. And by the time I finished writing about rivers, it was irrefutable to me. Contrary to Thoreau's early line about pressing water into service to speak for the human, that rivers had become vital collaborators in my book's making, in and with their own rights, that they had become non-trivially my co-authors. All our rivers in England are wounded. We have not a single river in good overall health. This is the cause, this has been caused by privatization. We privatized our water system in 1989. Since then, water has become liquefied as asset. Private equity companies have come in and sucked out immense sums in dividends, failed to invest in physical infrastructure for our rivers. And the consequence of this very young story, that water can be privatized and sold and floated on the equity market, is that we have 14% of our rivers in good overall ecological health and not a single one in good chemical health. And that means, because you have to pass both ratings, that we have not a single river in good health. So writing a book about the life and lives and deaths of rivers came about in part because I am surrounded by wounded rivers. This crisis is one of imagination as well as of legislation. We have somehow forgotten that our fate flows with that of rivers. Water has been reduced to one-dimensional water, to adapt Marcuse. It's been deterritorialized and organized in order to maximize yield. And the assetization of everything which is overtaken water with such consequence in my country has now reached calamity speed in yours under Donald Trump and his administration, and they have made abundantly clear their intention drastically to deprioritize the natural world in favor of immediate economic interest. A war against anima is underway. Doug Burgum, some of you American politics nerds like me, and I am one, listened to Burgum's Senate confirmation hearings, and in the course of that, I think it was 5 hours, I didn't last all of it, he described America's public lands as America's balance sheet. And here is where I realized that we really were looking from opposite ends of the telescope. He said that for the benefit of future generations, those public lands should be cracked open and extracted from for the benefit of future generations. I had always understood that the public lands were held for the benefit of future generations precisely by not cracking them open for the marrow that they hold. Rivers are the sort of slightly understudied victims, I think, of this rapid and severe reorientation towards ultra-assetization. And I spent a bit of time, as many of you will have done, deep in the weeds of Trump's executive orders recently. And that day one executive order declaring a national energy emergency included measures to waive or circumvent the Clean Water Act in order to fast-track energy projects on federal lands. And that has a whole bunch of consequences for water health. River health is also now threatened by the huge drive to expand American timber production. We know that logging, ill-managed, degrades water quality, it increases soil erosion, sediment runoff. The EPA, some of you will have noticed this, of course, as part of the immense regulatory rollback, I think the biggest in US regulatory history, which is underway, has moved to substantively narrow the range of what are called the waters of the United States. And those are the waters that enjoy federal protection from pollutants such as fertilizers and pesticides and mining wastes. And my understanding is that the intent is to sever water bodies which do not seem to connect to flowing water systems, so that you could have a wetland over here which appears not to be in any way connected to a flowing water system, and that would no longer be classified as a water of the United States and thereby enjoy that federal protection. There's a fundamental hydrological misunderstanding at the heart of it, but the intent is clear. Anthropocentrism waxes very strong in this current administration. It mismodels life as a pinnacle, upon whose point humans are aloofly poised. A scant 0.005% of the world's water flows in the world's rivers. They are rare. They are rare, and they are fragile, and they have been vital accomplices to human flourishing on Earth for thousands of years. When we view them only as sources, only as drains, we reduce them to the status of feedstock and service provider. We fail to see them for the life-giving and world-shaping forces that they are. Over the past 20 years, this fascinating counter-movement to the asset value account of rivers and indeed of nature has emerged. It's usually known as the rights of nature movement, and rivers have become its particular focus and rallying point. And this movement argues for the recognition of ecosystems and natural communities as rights-bearing beings. The recognition, not the bestowing. These are rights that have always existed, they have just never been given name. These are, of course, ancient ideas, but they are ideas that have been placed very often under amnesia and erasure by modernity, by extractivism, by colonialism. They are urgent ones, and the rights of nature movement is a messy and complex and compound set of forces, assemblage, set of communities, volitions, but at its best it has lit up activists and artists and lawmakers and politicians across 6 continents. Actually, I should say 7, because yesterday Cormac Cullinan, one of the early wild law theorists, was awarded the Shackleton Medal for his work on asserting and proposing a model for the recognition of the rights of Antarctica. Only 3 days ago, Anne-Marie Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, requested that the Assembly recognize a Bill of Rights for the River Seine. Interesting things are happening. It's rare that they gain purchase, but each of them is a knock, a thud against the profoundly, deeply embedded anthropocentric foundations of rights, among other things. And in 2008, in this remarkable act of moral imagination by a small country, Ecuador revised its constitution and inserted 4 articles, 71 to 74, the rights of nature articles, into its constitution. And they recognize the rights of nature to exist, to flourish, to persist, to respect. And there we see the reciprocity that this form of rights framing accords. These are beings in conversation with other beings, and respect is reciprocal. And the 4th of those, Article 74, makes the state the guarantor of those rights. So, in theory, and I should say that in practice it's much harder in a country increasingly beset by violence and by corruption. It's a story for another time. I remain very involved there. In theory, a citizen, private citizen, can bring a case within the legal system there if they believe that the rights of nature have been violated. That has happened once to enormous consequence, and many other attempts have been made to lesser consequence. Some of you will know that in 2017, the Whanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was recognised in a parliamentary act as a spiritual and physical entity with a life force and with rights, and a body of river guardians was appointed to speak for the river with the mandate of protecting and enhancing that life force. We have fought, said Gerard Albert, the lead negotiator for the Whanganui iwi during the Act's drafting, to find an approximation in law so that all others can understand that from our perspective, treating the river as a living entity is the correct way to approach it. A living entity as an indivisible whole instead of the traditional model of treating it from a perspective of ownership and management. So at its best, I take this movement, the Rights for Nature movement, to be a means of telling a different story about the living world, a very old story given new expression, a story in which the world is not a machine after all, as D.H. Lawrence put it, but rather alive and kicking. To quote the Nyakinawara scholar activist Anne Polina, Australian astonishing leader in this field, the law is being used creatively to train human beings, and agency is interesting to track in this sentence, so I'll go back to the beginning. The law is being used creatively to train human beings to listen, pay attention to, and learn from rivers. Such ideas and practices seem more important, more vital in the full, lively sense of that word now than perhaps ever before, when, to paraphrase Gramsci, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now, famously, is the time of monsters. This is a time when genocides will be televised, when sacrifice zones that engulf entire nations and ecosystems have come into being, when disaster capitalist billionaires prep for the coming end of Planet A by fast-tracking their escape pods for Planet B. And in the face of such monstrosities, it is notable and hopeful to me that for the past 2 years, the prestigious Goldman Prize, which is sometimes called the Nobel for Nature, has gone to water rights activists, both of them women, and women again and again are the leaders in these movements, who are using rights framings to protect water bodies. In 2024, Teresa Vicente was recognized for her work saving the grievously polluted Mar Menor lagoon in Spain from ecological collapse, and it led this grassroots campaign she led in 2022 to the Spanish Parliament, granting legal rights to the lagoon, and that was a first for a European political body. Of all the river journeys I made over the past 4 years, it was the last and the longest that became the most consequential. And in the summer of 2023, I travelled to Nitassinan, the unceded homeland of the Innu, in what you would probably know as northeastern Quebec. So we're talking about 600 miles northeast of Montreal. Keep driving. There's one road along the Côte Nord, really, and keep driving. And I went there to follow the course of a river that's known in English as the Magpie, but I refer to it by its Innu name, which is the Muteshekau Shipu, and that means the river where water passes between square, rocky cliffs, and it really does. I was drawn to that river because in February 2021, it became the first Canadian river to be recognised as a legal person and a living entity. and as the bearer of fundamental rights, including the right to flow freely, i.e. to be undamned. And that declaration was the result of a campaign led by a remarkable woman called Rita Mesta-Kosho, a poet, I think one of the great writers of this continent, who lives in the small township of Equanisht, near the mouth of the Muteshikau Shipu. And she was one of the co-drafters of this groundbreaking recognition, this very conceptually and verbally elegant joint resolution that was issued by the Innu Council at Equanisht and the Mingani Regional Council. So it was a sort of two-eyed seeing. It was a kind of settler declaration and an Innu declaration. So this is a river who rises near the Labrador border and then flows south over and through the ancient rocks of the Canadian Shield to reach the Gulf of St. Lawrence at the north coast near Anticosti Island. And we were dropped by float plane way up the system. And then over 11 days or so we paddled individual kayaks and we swam, particularly when the river was tired of our play, and we portaged about 100 miles of that river from the northern tip of the huge lake that feeds its lower half all the way to that silver green seamouth on the north coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And along the way we camped by rapids which gauzed water and sun in spectacular ways, and we suffered the sanguineous attentions of black flies. Do black flies get this far south? Hold on, I'm getting a mixed response here. I'm going to go with Laurette. Laurette says they do. I can say they really proliferate extensively up in the boreal forest. And the first wave hit us, and we just started bleeding extensively before we knew what had hit us. And then the histamine really kicked in, and I remember my friend Wayne, who'd been bitten all over his face and neck and cheeks and everything, and he got up the next morning, and I was like, "How you doing, Wayne?" And he said, "I've been massaging my eyeballs for the past 30 minutes so that I can see." So the histamine response was so good. He came out of his tent and he said, "Yeah, what they've done to me has fundamentally transformed the topography of my face." I was like, "Yeah, it really, really has." I was like, on the bright side, what they've done to you is symmetrical. And it's like maybe a free bug Botox. It's like all the wrinkles have gone away. So, but yeah, when Bill McKibben, the great environmentalist, was asked he became part of a kind of poll, what species would you take on the Ark? What would you save for the afterworld, after the rapture, or however you want to figure the apocalypse? We have plenty of choices now. And Bill said the black fly. Everyone else was like, the unicorn or the lion or something. It was like, why the black fly? It keeps us humble. It shows us our limits. I was like, yes. The black flies were part of the asperity of that journey, and I am grateful to them in a way, partly because they gave me a great story to tell in non-black fly zones, and I won't ever be entering a black fly zone again. But they were part of an opening that happened to me, which I find hard to account for, but I give my best attempt of it in the book. And that was also partly due to Rita. And I went to see Rita firstly and foremostly to ask her permission to travel the river that had flowed through the life of her people for 8,000 years. There was no way I was going to plop myself on it and paddle 100 miles down it without Rita's consent. It took me 4 days to get to Equanisht from my home. And if she'd said no, I would have turned around and felt very disappointed, but I would have gone home. I said, "Rita, very nervously, Rita, can I paddle the river? Can I travel the river?" And she laughed at me. She was like, "Yeah, obviously you have my permission. The permission you need is the river's." I was like, "How do I get that? Is it paperwork based or forms in triplicate?" And she said, "You'll work it out. But you've got to learn to listen, and you've got to learn to see differently." And she said to me, you look too much with your eyes, you think too much with your head, you don't feel enough with your heart. and you are not taking your notebooks on the river. I was like, Rita, the first 3, fine. You're bang to rights, yes. But the notebooks we have to talk about. So we came to a negotiated settlement, which was that I could take my notebooks, but I could not write when I was on the water, which we were for most of the day. I could only write when I was on the bank. And I laughed about it at the time, but I realized it was part of her forcing me to see and think differently and to surrender myself to the flow, which is what the river then did with astonishing power and consequence. She writes her poetry only in Innu Aiman, and French. If you have French, I would warmly recommend you to seek out her poetry, Rita Mestakosho, and perhaps it can be sent round via the Thoreau Society to people who are on the list. And I'm just now starting to translate, with her permission, obviously, her poetry into English. So we have an ongoing friendship. She gave us a lot of tasks when we were on the river. We had to get water here, we had to collect Labrador tea there, we had to always pitch our tents facing east so the sun greeted us every morning. That was sometimes tricky because when you pitched on a very narrow stretch of sand, it meant that we had to face our tents directly into a small rock face, which was, I would say, the view could be better, but Rita said face east, so we faced east. And then we underwent this extraordinary rivering, and she left me with one other instruction, which was, you have one question for the river. The river will answer it, but only if it's the right question. I was like, crap. How do I work? Better make it a good one. Well, I did make that journey. I'm incredibly grateful to Rita, the black flies, and to the Muteshikau Shipu. And that river journey, coming atop other river journeys I'd made over those years, turned me upside down and shook me out. And they left me more changed and more aware than in years of the infinitesimal fathoming of this world's mysteries that I've made in decades of trying to take its soundings. They will only ever be infinitesimal. We're only ever holding up a candle to the cave wall, and the outer dark surrounds us. But one morning, after we have been on and in and by the river constantly for 9 days and 100 miles or so, and always within earshot and mind shot of the river, and deep in one of the vastest continuous forests on this earth, that morning I approach on foot the jaws of bedrock through which the river crashes and thunders at a place called the Gorge, and it is the place to which, it turns out, all the tributaries, physical and metaphysical, have been flowing for years. And the rock at the gorge's edge is stepped and smoothed and is 4 billion years old and shines in the spray. And I stop a yard from the brink, and at my feet the river smashes ceaselessly into a supermassive white hole of its own making, churning and quaking, and I feel queasy and drawn and obsessed, and I can feel the rock beneath me shuddering from the water's force, and the vibrations move through my body as if it were a tuning fork, so that my bones turn turbulent, and my mind also. And now the rock I stand on gleams and is liquid. It roils and has eddies, though they are too slow for my human eyes to see, and the water is all pearls and bulbs, and the rock is those things too, so I must surely fall through it or sink into it, and there are sounds with no source, and spray from the gorge drifts upon me, dewing my clothes and wetting my eyes, and tiny rainbows roam like iridescent insects. And then speaking no longer seems tolerable, and I am unable any longer to decline the compulsion to move closer to the river. So I step right to the very edge of the gorge, a few inches from destruction, where water and rock and air are all three glossy, and I glance up and understand that I am looking into a mouth, an immense river moor that pours between the jaws of the gorge, and I see that this mouth has a tongue, a vast green-white tongue which tapers and glides to its tip, where it licks away at the bright white supermassive hole right at my feet. And I hear that speech is tumbling out of this mouth, has been tumbling out of it since the old ice left, that this is a place where the ghost realms of times past and times future overlap with one another, each transparent to the other. And I try to peer right and left into these laminar worlds, but the river mouth and its river voices hold me in this one, here, and the river's tongue now is the tongue of tongues, and the river's song is the song of songs, slip-shifting and shape-sliding and veering, sung in spirals and stars and roars and other notes beyond hearing. And the voice sings what I cannot understand, however much I long to, and my heart is full of flow, and I sit because I can no longer stand, and then I have the dim but unmistakable sense at the shatterbelt of my awareness of an incandescent aura made of something like bears and angels, but not bears and angels, something that is always transforming, and in that moment it is clear to me that this is the aura of a river being, for why should a god make choices we recognize as choices? And the coast of my mind senses this force, and I know that this is no Pepper's ghost, no projection or illusion or trick, and that the question Rita wanted me to ask of the river is nothing to do with fear or age, but is after all, and of course, the question of life, which is not a question at all, but a world. And the river's voices say and say and say what I cannot comprehend, and each time I lean out to listen, it retreats in the measure I approach it. So instead I start to scrawl the pages you are listening to here, and the paper glistens with river mist until I'm just jotting words in blotted ink that runs into curls as phrases pour into the notebook from a source vastly greater than the sphere of my skull. And I find tears in my eyes that I didn't put there, but the river did. And for those few minutes, hard by that hourglass-shaped and silvered rapid that is a mouth and has a tongue and utters after those days and miles and years on and with and in the flow, I am rivered. Thank you. Great. Hi. Yes. Just wait for the mic. Coming round.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here to hear you and to read your books.
Thank you.
I'm just reading The Wild Places, and your writing is so descriptive. I'm wondering, do you take photographs at all when you're in your travels? And how do you capture, like, in the moment, and be so descriptive? How are you writing as you're, living through these experiences? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your words. Well, I'll give an abstract and then a concrete example. So there's a Rilke line, Rainer Maria Rilke, in Letters to a Young Poet, which I think is probably the best distillate of creative advice that I've ever met. And I know a lot of artists who think the same. And Rilke says there, the work of the eyes is done. Now go and do the heart work upon the images buried inside you. And it's helped me think about the two stages of writing, the eye work and then the heart work on the images buried inside you. And the eye work, actually, which is, I suppose, what initially you were asking about, I find the easy bit. I think I see and remember very visually, and although I'm also hugely interested in synesthesia, and so a lot of the sentences I seem to be remembering with the ear and the nose and the skin and the eyes at the same time, and then trying to find a diction which allows those senses to live simultaneously, often in ways that seem contradictory. So I think there's a line in The Wild Places that just says, I enter a bothy and it just says, the air smelt green. and you kind of know exactly what I mean, but you shouldn't be able to smell it anyway. So, but the heart work is the hard bit, and the recognition of the way those patterns of image arise. and they only really, to me, arise over long periods of time, so the books take a long time, is one of the most exciting and strange aspects of the work. And I'm only really beginning to learn how to pattern those images or allow them to pattern themselves across big phases of writing. And then they take on an operative power which is nothing to do with the propositional. And then very briefly, people keep asking, how did I remember all of the conversations, and particularly in this book, Is a River Alive? Particularly in the third section, and I was traveling with this man called Wayne, and Wayne speaks like almost no one I've ever come across before, but he also has a memory that is supernatural. He once began reciting a poem that he wrote 32 years earlier, and he got 241 lines in before he stumbled for the first time, and he was mad with himself. So literally, we would have these conversations, and I wouldn't want to record them or write them down, and then we'd end them, and I'd say, Wayne, could you repeat the conversation we just had while I record it? And so it's like basically my subject was also my dictaphone. It was great. Yeah, all right, thanks. Yeah, we'll go there, and then we'll go there. Yes. Hi.
Thank you. What a brilliant talk and full philosophy about rivers.
Thank you.
I completely embrace what you're saying, and I'm privileged to hear it that way. I grew up at the mouth of the Connecticut River, so I spent a lot of time on the river and really can relate what you're saying. But I have a fundamental question. I really understand or relate to this, the river being alive and have rights and everything. Such an important part of what a river has contributed to our nation's growth, particularly throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, is the power that drive mills, to drive manufacturing, to drive the development of our economy. But I can also see where that is doing bad things to the river, of damming it up. So I was just wondering what your perspective was on our relationship with the river and the power that has provided us to grow our nation and et cetera.
Yeah, no, there's no easy answer here. Different versions of force. Different versions of force. And it's not that I want to abolish the instrumental model of relationship with rivers. It's made all of this possible. It's made miracles of human flourishing possible. Dams have supplied clean drinking water and to a certain extent clean electricity to millions, indeed billions of people. So, and have been worshipped as temples of modernity. And the New Deal, and well, we know something of the stories of dams in this country. We also see now the de-damming movement, which is starting to take real momentum and is part of a bigger reimagining of that relationship. And I won't spend too much time on the Klamath story, but those who have followed that story will see what happens when you reimagine a river as undammed, and a different kind of force arises from it. So for me, it is that the instrumental story has risen to become so dominant, and accompanying it has been the, shall we say, delusion of infinite capacity, which is a broader delusion that I think substantially compromises our relationship with the living world as a whole. But that the river will always carry away the waste we give it, and it will always supply the water that we need from it. But I come back to the sense that they are fragile and rare beings, presences, forces with whom we have co-flourished. So it's a restoring of that relationship is what I'm trying to drive. And I'm not the only one. I mean, there's incredible river guardian movements all around the world that are doing this thinking. And it's a future thinking. It really is. So thanks. It's a great question. The green scarf, please. And then, yes, there. We'll go there, and then there. Okay, yes, thank you.
Thanks so much. My name is Ann Taylor, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Mount Holyoke College, and I work on interpretive agency, and your book has helped me so much in thinking through agency and interpretation, and not just philosophically, but stylistically, just the way that you actually put that into words so poetically. I wanted to ask you about this phrase that I've been working through myself by a philosopher called Edouard Glissant, the right to opacity. And when you are speaking for rivers or speaking for forests or speaking for mountains as river guardians or as, a writer yourself, how do you make sense of opacity? How do you make sense of beings who purposefully are opaque and do not always want to be known in the constructs that we have to know?
Yeah, what a wonderful question, Glissant, the right to opacity. I have always been much more interested in how language fails than in how language succeeds. So that opacity is impenetrable by language. And a key text that sort of orbits this book is Stanislav Lem's Solaris, which has a whole bunch of problems going on in it, but is also one of the most remarkable speculative inquiries into exactly what you're talking about, which is the attempt to theorize, to open a plausible line of communication with a sentient ocean. So, it's a science fiction text, but it is staging and interrogating precisely what might be called the withdrawn nature of that supposed sentience. Lem's novel has a line that bounced around my brain a lot. How can we hope to understand a river when we cannot even understand each other? And there is a sense in which one of the consequences of the right to opacity is that it rebounds the requirement for communication back to the species that is doing the asking, and suggests that they carry it out as an intraspecies rather than an interspecies or interbeing project. And I'm very inclined towards that. But I do not, the last thing I'll say is I do not try to speak for the river. I believe that I was thinking and writing with the river in ways in which that agency is largely kind of inscrutable to me, but the experience of it was unmistakable. But otherwise, there's nowhere where I ventriloquize the river in full voice, as it were, and that always seemed to me a dead end, perhaps precisely because of the theory of the right to opacity. But it's a fascinating question, and the river remains very opaque. Let's put it like that, even at the end there. So I think we'll go there, and then here, if we have time for 3 questions. I'll make my answers shorter. Sorry that I'm banging on.
Thank you very much for your book and for this dialogue in highlighting the capacity and plight of rivers across the world. I have the great good fortune of working with the Connecticut River Conservancy, which flows 410 miles, the great river, through 4 New England states. And one of the tasks I've set for myself is to help us think of ourselves as citizens, as residents, as inhabitants of a watershed, rather than 4 distinct arbitrary political subdivisions. And that's a big task, and I would be greatly helped by your assistance in how we might begin to shift our conception to being citizens of a watershed rather than an arbitrary political boundary.
Wonderful question, wonderful to hear the work you're doing. Let me see if I can give 3 very quick responses to this. One is the watershed test. So I think that we should encourage every citizen, that is to say everyone who lives in a watershed, which is to say everyone, to be able to name the chain of rivers and waters that flow past them, back to the source and to the ocean. I think there's just a heuristic, as it were, that connects people to the sense that they live in a watershed. They live with and by flowing water. And names are a whole other question, and we can get into those, and I would always rather use the first names, as it were, where possible. Then I would suggest having a look at the Parliamentary Act. It's called the Te Awa Tapua Act, the 2017 Whanganui River Claims Settlement Act, which is fully available on the Aotearoa New Zealand parliamentary website. And you'll see there that central to that is watershed thinking. And the river I sometimes say that to speak of a river as its main channel is to speak of a tree as its trunk. You forget the branches and the leaves that form the watershed, and you forget the roots that form the relationship between fresh and salt. I think that you might find some interesting framings and phrasings in the early part of that act. A spiritual and physical entity, a living and indivisible whole from the mountains to the sea. And the third is just a note to say that CABA, what we call CABA in English water governance language, so-called catchment-based management, is really, really making a comeback now, or really rising up. And 20 years ago, catchment-based thinking just wasn't happening. And it's exciting to see it emerging. And in fact, it was named, it was one of the few good points of the interim report of the Independent Water Commission, which is the biggest shake-up of water management since privatisation that's currently underway in our country. Thank you. So it's going to go there, and then, yes, a black gentleman there, please. Hi.
Robert, first of all, it's so great to hear you speaking live and hear the passion and hearing your voice that I've been reading across your works over a number of years. Just a great joy.
Thank you.
You recently wrote an op-ed piece where you made a really interesting comment about the idea of a river being alive and comparing that to corporations being alive, which I view as almost superhuman because you can't put them in prison. They actually have more rights than humans do. But it was a really interesting comment you made in that. I was just wondering if could you expand on that for just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think everyone will know here that corporations, companies have a suite of rights under certainly UK and US law. And under UK law, that suite of rights is guaranteed in part by the European Convention on Human Rights, and it includes the right to privacy, it includes the right to a fair trial. And when I'm talking, I'm not a zealot about river rights. I think there's many ways in which the model is flawed at its best. I think it translates the grammar of animacy into the, shall we say, the grammar of power, and that excites me. But that's at its best. But people say, oh, rights for a river, impossible. And there are lots of conventional arguments. Oh, if it has rights, does it have responsibilities? Can we sue the river when it floods? Why should we give a river rights when human rights are being violated multiply around the world on a daily basis? That is the zero-sum model of rights which power loves to appeal to because it keeps the status quo intact. If you model rights as the addition of any right will result in a concomitant subtraction of another right, the zero-sum model, then you are in effect defending the status quo. That is not how rights work. Rights legislate relationships between beings and entities and communities, and they're vital ligaments, but they do not exist in a zero-sum relationship. But I sometimes use the corporation to instantiate the idea that a non-human entity can be a rights-bearing entity. People are like, oh, okay. But, I mean, here's my final thought. I do not want rivers to have the same rights as corporations, because corporations screw rivers, and there is no easy read across. So we need to reimagine that rights basis for rivers and recognize that it's not being bestowed, it's being acknowledged. Recognize that it's inalienable, and recognize that it is separable from responsibility. And I'll end that thought there. One here. I don't know how people, I mean, you've all got places to go, I know. So,
thank you especially for the work of the heart, as you put it. And I'm still reverberating in that moment where you end by saying I've been rivered. And it's taking me to watching very small children and some of their most significant moments when they're even just weeks and months old is their relationship with inanimate things. And whether it's, figuring that they can drop the food on the floor or their transitional object. And I'm thinking that one way, and I know you've lots to say about rocks too, which I'm fascinated by, and just feeling like you're inviting us to re-examine our relationship with the inanimate world as a whole, from the most fundamental moments of or ways of our being, as you were in that moment that you described. And so I'm stuck there, and I'm hoping you can take that further.
Oh, well, it was interesting to hear you, even as you were speaking about overcoming it, reallocate the word inanimate to the world that you're describing, as it were. And so, yeah, it is the work of reanimation. And I suppose I could just say that I've come to in the philosophical fields of ontology, that is the study of the theorizing of the nature of being, broadly divides into process ontology and substance ontology. And substance ontology allocates life to the unit. And process ontology allocates life to the interface. That is to say, it is fundamentally processual and relational in nature, and that what we mistake as the unit of our body is in fact always and only and ever intersubjectively in relationship with the given world, that is also tumbling and processually in relationship with itself. So being shifts from a noun to a verb, from a state to a process. A few things, I think, teach us that better than a river. The relational ontology model is a kind of easy place to get to, but a hard place to build from. And I won't start to try to do that now, but I would recommend to anyone who's interested in this the work of Tim Ingold, who's an archaeologist and, well, predominantly an anthropologist, though he's very interdisciplinary. And some of his work on life is some of the best I've read on this reimagining of anima as relation.
We'll take one last question.
I'm good for one. Yeah, if folks are, I think, yeah.
I think they get to me. Thank you for the wonderful work that you do, and your talk tonight was just spectacular. So I'm rereading Arctic Dreams now, which I read about 20 years ago. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, God, he has to know Barry Lopez. So I checked the index, and sure enough, I go to page 223, and you refer to him as your friend. So I'm curious about your relationship with him, and maybe if you could speak for a moment about what his work has meant to a lot of writers, a lot of people, and someone like yourself.
Thank you. It's a lovely invitation to close what's been, for me at least, a really wonderful and affirming evening. Thank you. Barry was he was a North Star, let's say. He was a very North-minded person, though he was incredibly generous and prolific in his geographies. And I read him. He made me a writer. He blew open my sense of what the weirdly named non-fiction could be. Turned it into a terrain of possibility, of hybridity, of braiding, weaving. He mixed glittering prose poetry and reportage and cultural history and anthropology and politics. Arctic Dreams, if you haven't read it, still holds up, I think, even, it'll be 40 years on, I think, now, this year. National Book Award winner, absolute landmark for me, and so many others in that heteroglossia, the many-tonguedness of it, the bright crystalline vision, but also the deep, deep compassion that it embodies for land and for people, for otherness of many kinds. And we corresponded for years. I once returned home from school to find a school pickup. I opened the door, and on the letter mat was an envelope, and there was clearly a typewriter. A typewriter had been used to type the address. And I looked on because you Americans do this thing where you put your sender address on the outside of the envelope on the top left. And it was Barry Lopez. And I literally, if I'd found a rattlesnake on my doormat, I would have been less surprised. I leapt. It was like, how did he get my address? And Barry Lopez! Anyway, it was a very sweet letter, which was mildly taking me to task for getting a factual detail wrong about something in an essay I'd written about him. So it was slightly an auspicious beginning to our friendship, but that friendship did flourish, first by correspondence and then finally in person. And meeting Barry in 2019, when he drove 4.5 hours each way with stage 4 cancer to meet me, to place a stone that he'd picked up in a ventifact from Antarctica in my hand, and very much wanted to, I think, he knew death was coming, and he wanted to instruct me and task me with work. And shortly after that, he was, as some people will know, he was burned out of his house by the green apple. I think it was a green apple wildfire that leapt over the hill and down to the banks of the Mackenzie, where he lived for 40 years. And that ate a lot of his archive that hadn't had time to move. Didn't burn the house, but it burnt them out of the house. And Barry's typewriter, on which he typed my address on that letter, and almost all of his books was burned. And in the final months of his life, led by Jim Warren and other friends, we bought him the exact same Olivetti typewriter that he'd lost in the fire, but the sadness is that he never wrote anything else on it, and he died not long after that. But so I miss him very much. He continues to inspire me and countless others from beyond the grave, and he understood geography to be generosity. Thank you.